Star Soldier Vanishing Earth for Star Soldier
Generally, you can
64.
tell when these story videos are going to feature good companies by the amount of
Kim
actual
Justice in the
game
background.
chat there's going to be. Hence why we spent about 5 minutes on Imagine's games last time out, and another 25 on detailing the rise and fall of the company. With Psygnosis, Imagine's spiritual successor, we'll be doing the opposite.
Okay.
Psygnosis are one of the
45 million.
greatest companies in British software history. They had such a unique style, they were never terribly run into the ground, and the amount of talent that passed through the company is not just legendary, but quite possibly unmatched by any other UK games company. They were kind of a hybrid, publishers with an absolute house style, a great understanding of development, and the need for just about anything they did to be quality. And geez, they almost managed it. They could do it all. And so, this is their story, told mostly through their games. The reason why they got to the very top of the UK gaming world not once, but twice. Two important Imagine figures were crucial in Psygnosis' history. David Lawson was the programming whiz kid who made Imagine's most famous game, Arcadia, and Ian Hetherington was the guy in charge of finance. Which one do you think would be the figurehead of the new company? It's weird. Ian Hetherington, the rather surly one, he who always looks on the verge of hitting someone throughout commercial breaks and never ever speaks, didn't look like the guy then. But hey, you always evolve. Hetherington would be Psygnosis' boss for nearly 15 years, covering both of their most successful periods. And yet, by all accounts, he's pretty damn good at it. Again, there's not all that many tales of corporate intrigue, backstabbing and mismanagement here. In fact, there aren't any. Psygnosis is by and large the story of how these young hotheads, several of whom amongst those who'd fucked up so spectacularly before, learned from their mistakes and got it right. Let me put it this way. Ian Hetherington loves to drive Ferraris about, but Psygnosis never had a bloody racing team. He, along with Lawson and a man named Jonathan Ellis, would co-found the company with Hetherington in the driving seat. Psygnosis came into existence in late 1984 as Finchspeed, the company set up with Mark Butler also in tow to actually finish Imagine's doomed Bandersnatch. They succeeded, but the name was already soiled somewhat, and so they changed their name to Psygnosis in 1985, which is probably around the time that Butler leaves the picture for good. And of course the prog rock cover artist Roger Dean, who'd previously worked on Bandersnatch, was brought in to create the company's logo, which would be the start of a very productive relationship. Psygnosis' first game set the stall out quite early. They had graphics and presentation that was really damn good for the time, not to mention fancy box art and all sorts like that, but they were usually marred with control problems. At the end of the video on Imagine we mentioned Guatarcas, their first game which so happened to be the final form of Bandersnatch, Imagine's unreleased mega game. And, well, at least the bloody thing came out so no one could talk about it anymore. Controlling the game is madness. You do with a mouse, it's awful. On another note, the ultimate fate of Cyclaps, the other mooted mega game, was to be used as an alternative name for Psygnosis on a couple of more arcadey early titles, particularly Ballistics, which you can see here. It's a future sports game, and alas not one that's remembered so much compared to the likes of Speedball. It's also here in Menace. Both of these are very important games though, for reasons that we will get to quite soon. Anyway, let's jump in the gun. Psygnosis' early games continued in a similar vein to Guatarcas, with decisions that could be baffling, but getting that little bit better every time out. David Lawson did their first two games after Guatarcas, and, well, they were doozies. Deep Space is a space shooter of sorts that comes off a bit like an Elite clone, but nowhere near as good. It's not terrible, but then, well, there's Barbarian. Not the more famous game with Wolf from Gladiators, but a side-scrolling game that you control by using the mouse to pick from a range of options. Needless to say, this does not work out all that well, but the game is there if you ever wanted to play a side-scrolling point-and-click action game. The same control scheme was also used, to only marginally better effect, in 1988's Obliterator, a game that these days is mostly famous for looking somewhat similar to another very famous Psygnosis game, at least in one picture. Aside from that, it and the Beast are unrelated, and frankly I think the inspiration was more HR Giga here than, Graham Shadow the Beast movie. Obliterator is also notable as being the last game that Imagine's co-founder David H. Lawson is credited on. There is very little info on him after 1988, so one wonders if he left Psygnosis around that time, or indeed if he left the industry altogether. Lawson fades into history. While Imagine alumni such as John Gibson and Graham Kenny Everett, arriving by way of Denton Designs, were now working for Psygnosis, from this point on Ian Hetherington is all that was left of the Rock and Roll Games Company's boardroom. Of this very early crop of games, the most famous and best is undoubtedly Terrapods from 1987, which was actually co-made by Hetherington. It's an odd little game, a tank shooter with lots of resource management thrown in, the sort of game that you need to play with for a good while before you even figure out how to start. It tries to do way too much, but it's not a bad little title. Of course, these days it's more famous for its box art, a classic Roger Dean jobby that looks bloody amazing. Still, Psygnosis' immediate future didn't lie in development. These games looked very snazzy for the time, with intros and everything, definitely showing off the Amiga, but they were very ropey from a gameplay perspective. For now, Psygnosis' future lay in publishing, and oh boy did they strike gold with the small teams under their whip. Menace is the first game to be just plain published by Psygnosis, and as mentioned it falls under the Cyclops name. It's a very hard and, on the whole, quite average Gradius-esque shooter, but it comes with some okay music and graphics. Generally, it's got a okay feel about it. A bit ho-hum. Except for it being made by David Jones and Toby Smith. And yes, that is David Grand Theft Auto Jones. Menace is the first game by DMA Design. Quite a humble beginning, but a historical one. Little did anyone know just what these guys would go on to do. Next up is the aforementioned Ballistics, another quite odd game. It's future sports with graphics that are pretty damned great for this early on in the Amiga, but a really odd concept. You use your pointer to fire balls at another ball in order to try and get it up the field. It's not really a sports game as such, it's more of a puzzler. It didn't exactly bother the likes of Speedball, but again, it is important. Why? Well, because it was made by Martin Edmondson and Paul Howarth. It's the first game by Reflections Interactive. Even if this game might not exactly be a hit, it wouldn't be much longer before they hit pay dirt. But before that, we come to the last game of Psygnosis' formative period, and the one that could be considered their breakthrough, 1989's Blood Money by DMA Design. It's another shooter, an evolution of Menace by way of Irem's Mr. Heli, with an iconic intro, a ravey soundtrack, and, as usual, some mighty fine graphics. You'll be hearing that a lot.
First, there was men. Now, Psygnosis presents a DMA design game.
And yeah, this is a damn good game, without any qualifiers whatsoever. It's got a sense of humour, it's a vicious challenge, and a lot of things about it just work. Even though it is quite old now, it still plays a good game for an 80s computer shoot 'em up. It is by some distance the best game that Psygnosis had released to that point, and it got some rave reviews. Zap64 even went as far to say that Blood Money was the best Amiga game of the 1980s, which is pretty frickin' effusive no matter which way you look at it. After a couple of years where they'd shown plenty of potential, Psygnosis, as publishers, had finally scored their first bona fide hit, and plenty more was to come. And hell, they'd already lasted twice as long as Imagine had. Gradually, Psygnosis eased into being a company that ostensibly specialised in publishing games. However, the way they worked was very different from most publishers at the time, who naturally focused their efforts more on marketing the games that they had. Psygnosis, weirdly, for a publisher, didn't focus on that. Instead, what they did was in many ways an extension of the ethos at Imagine, in a good way. Psygnosis, under both the smart, level-headed publishing hand of Jonathan Ellis and fierce creative vision of Hetherington, spent considerable money on what would be called advanced technology, whether that be looking at CD-ROMs or whatever, or new forms of compression and the like that would help create, for example, the intros that a lot of their games would become quite famous for. The company always had one eye on the future, and they would take their research and development as far as they possibly could. As I said, Ian doesn't give interviews much, but here's an example of just how on the ball he was. He predicted not only that CD-ROMs were the future of the games industry, but that the bigger electronics and mass consumer corporations would eventually enter and dominate the marketplace. He did this in 1990, completely against all the industry's trends back then, when there was no Sony in video games, no Microsoft, no nothing. And CD-ROMs were nothing. The standard wasn't even a year old, and the likes of Sherlock Holmes' Consulting Detective hadn't even been released at that point. They were still a year away. Some bosses are right up front with grand promises and what have you, but arguably the best ones are those quietly pulling all the strings behind the scenes. And that's what Ian is. Also, few publishers are concerned with having a specific style for their games. That sort of thing's easy to spot with developers, but not so much with publishers. But Psygnosis were different. Even if two games had been developed by two completely different teams, it's likely that they would still have that certain style that made them recognisably a Psygnosis product. How so? Well, Psygnosis had an art team. More than that, Psygnosis' art team was and has been frequently named as one of the best art teams working in the industry. While coding would still often happen externally, Psygnosis' art team would pair up with the external developers to ensure that the game met their fairly demanding standards. It also helped that Psygnosis did still have their hand in. While games actually fully developed under the Psygnosis name weren't amongst their most famous in these days, they were always there. It is fairer to say that they were a hybrid company who did both publishing and development. And so there was a lot of quality control. Psygnosis tried hard to ensure they wouldn't release terrible games. While standards were high, they were very supportive of developers. Small teams could happily work at Psygnosis' offices while still remaining independent. It was for many one of the best positions you could get in the industry at the time, and Psygnosis only accepted the best into their fold. And this is how Psygnosis gradually accrued some unbelievable developing talent who would have monumental impact in the years to come. Obviously, we've already seen DMA and Reflections, but there's more. On the games front, we're now in 1989. Thanks to DMA's designs ever improving early titles, particularly Blood Money, Psygnosis are starting to build a decent reputation. But the second big dev team under their wing were just about to tear the roof off, with something truly mind-blowing, one of Psygnosis' definitive games. I think you know what's coming next. In 1989, not long after Blood Money, Reflections Interactive would release their second game, Shadow of the Beast. Now, I've already covered Beast quite a lot on this channel, so I'll sum up briefly. The first Beast was, at the time, staggering. The parallax and sheer quality of the graphics made for an unbelievable demo, something that wowed everybody, and truly sold the Amiga as a state-of-the-art games machine in Europe. You could even argue that Shadow of the Beast was crucial to the Amiga getting a major edge on the Atari ST. Quite simply, the Atari could not do this game justice. Gameplay-wise, yeah, it's not held up quite as well. The controls are finicky, the hit detection's all over the shop, the game itself is utterly unforgiving. It's a frustrating game. Still, the impact of it cannot be overstated. It was a classic, and it was the game that put Psygnosis right at the forefront of the Amiga. Even at the eye-watering cost of £35 plus a Roger Dean t-shirt, and despite magazines questioning the actual gameplay even back then, the Beast was a big freaking deal. Its sequel would follow pretty sharpish, coming out as soon as 1990, and if anything it upped the graphics ante even further, what with essentially having a full video as its introduction. Psygnosis couldn't ever not have a memorable intro, it seemed. The game itself just looks amazing. The muted colours, utterly alien landscapes make it one of the most memorable looking 2D platforms I have ever seen. However, it makes the original game look easier, one of the most irritating games of them all. But, my lord, it looked like something else. And all the Roger Dean artwork, the posters and the t-shirts that would often just be thrown in with the whole package, it would all help to make Beast a top seller and one of the most recognised series of games on the Amiga. Of course, the thing most people remember about it these days is that game over screen and music, which, funnily enough, was copied from an episode of Miami Vice. Listen for yourself, and shout-outs to Laffer35 for finding the original piece. But of course there was a lot more than just the beats from Psygnosis. Here's another great game from 1990, The Killing Game Show. A vertically inclined platformer where you have to get your droid to the top of a level before you're killed either by Empress enemies or the ever-rising water. You might also know this game from consoles as Fatal Rewind. It's another stupendously hard game but much fairer than Shadow of the Beast is. You know what you're getting into, and you can not only view an instant replay of your last life, but you can continue from any point in that replay. And it introduces another soon-to-be great developer. This game was made entirely by Martin Chudley as part of his own team, Raising Hell. They would soon change name, and then change name again, and ultimately become Bizarre Creations. And we'll be seeing them a couple more times in this video. How about another really good game by a soon-to-be great developer? Here's Leander, a fantasy-style side-scroller of a game with lots of levels that again you might know from its Mega Drive version, where it was called The Legend of Galahad. As far as gameplay goes, this and The Killing Game Show are both bloody brilliant, and they certainly show that Psygnosis weren't wholly concerned with just good graphics. Also, Leander was the first game to be made by a somewhat obscure studio called Traveller's Tales, who never really amounted to much aside from a whole bunch of licensed games for toys. Again, we'll be seeing them a couple more times in this video. So that's 4 great, or soon-to-be great, developers who got their start with Psygnosis. It's not a bad selection all told, and they would continue to bear fruit. Hell, DMA Design were about to make everyone involved a not inconsiderable amount of money, thanks to a bunch of blue jumpsuits wearing, green-haired, impressionable males. Even considering how successful Psygnosis' games had been for the past couple of years, Lemmings in 1991 was the biscuit taker. The new franchise, a game that would sell millions upon millions. Word has it that it all came from a simple little 8x8 sprite that Scott Johnson and Mike Daly were toying with in deluxe paint that gradually, with input from the rest of the team, turned into a full game. That same game has apparently, over all of its many ports, sold roughly 15 million copies, which might just make it the most successful thing ever to come out of the Amiga. It's such a beautiful concept. You give these lemmings roles that will not only help them to stay alive and not just fall to their death or blindly walk into a trap, but also get them to the end of a level. One could say that it is something of an irony that after all these big, grandiose games with the Roger Dean prog rock style artwork and shit, Psygnosis' best and most successful game is so casual and simple. So much so that Psygnosis actually turned it down at one point. But Lemmings has an amazing miniaturised art style all of its own. As far as puzzle games go, it's pretty close to perfection. Now, I've always been terrible at the game, but that doesn't ever stop it from being tremendously fun. DMA Design were now, at this point, up there with all the top Amiga dev teams, worthy of being mentioned in the same breath as Bullfrog, Sensible Software, and the Bitmaps. But while Lemmings undisputedly made them top of Psygnosis' tree, the other geniuses at the company were never going to be too far behind. Not all of the devs who worked at Psygnosis would go on to greatness. Some, like Art and Magic, would fall into obscurity. And yet their single computer game, Agony from 1992, is still somewhat well known. It's a shooter where you play as an owl, and it's a crapload better than Calibri on the 32X. Indeed, the owl itself is supposed to be Psygnosis' logo. Agony is in many ways the shooter version of Shadow of the Beast. The setting is unusual, as is the main theme, Tim White's legendary mournful piano piece. And of course the graphics, parallax and visual effects are staggering. The game itself can't quite match up to that. It is an annoying shooter to play in many ways, but it is still an interesting game, for sure. Art and Magic only lasted for a couple of years, producing this and a couple of very obscure arcade games, but at least they made one game that stood out. Psygnosis themselves were getting stronger as developers too, and I can't not mention one of their best efforts, Bill's Tomato game from 1992. It's not a typical Psygnosis game at all, perhaps in part made to get a bit more of that cute Lemmings magic, very cutesy European Amiga type stuff where you're a tomato saving your tomato girlfriend. Thing is, the game is a fantastic puzzler that's almost as good as Lemmings, and I'm really not joking about that. I love puzzlers like this. Fit fans, trampolines and what have you in the right spot, hit the screen, see what happens and tweak, tweak, tweak. It's just so satisfying when a big plan comes together, when you get through a level that almost seemed impossible. Criminally, Bill's Tomato game was never released anywhere except on the Amiga and ST. The phrase hidden gem is overused, but this is absolutely one. If you like puzzle games at all, especially Incredible Machine type ones, you should play it. There's one more major game to close out this period of Psygnosis, the third and final Shadow of the Beast game by Reflections, released in 1992. Unlike the previous two games, this one didn't get ported out to all and sundry, which was a crying shame. Beast 3 is the best game in the series by far, with the same very high standard of graphics and music and the like, but now with fantastic puzzle-based gameplay to boot. Reflections even got the action right this time, as the now much more human Argon is a joy to control. An excellent and very tight game, only marred slightly by being very short indeed. This is the Beast game that anyone should play if they're looking for something that is honestly very good, and it brought the original Beast trilogy to a neat little close. no one would have minded too much if it ended here, honestly. But with Psygnosis' teams now all making really good games to go along with the stupendous graphical stylings, Psygnosis were in a great position going into 1993, where things would change a little. Before we get to that, there's a couple of lesser lights to run through quickly. These games aren't famous at all, but some of them might be worth a bit of time. Atomino is a simple little puzzle game where you have to create molecules on a grid. It's kind of difficult and not something I've ever gotten along with, but the game does have a few fans. Amnios is a thrust-esque shooter with kind of naff controls. It looks good and there's a lot of stuff to shoot, but it moves like a game from 1987, which isn't very good for 1991. Here's Armageddon. It's a combat vehicle sim with 1991 standard 3D and proper simulation controls for both planes and tanks and the like, meaning that I'm sure some like it, but I don't have a clue of what I'm doing. And, well, I can't let this chapter go without mentioning that Psygnosis co-created the custom Face-Off games for the US TV Kids show Nick Arcade in 1992, all of which were developed for and implemented on Amigas. As an aside though, I have no idea why so many of these games begin with A. Did Psygnosis want all their games to be at the front of the software guides? Like how someone would call their company Aaron Arsehole Window Cleaners and Son, so they were at the front of the phone book in yellow pages? Who knows? Anyway, there are other games, but we can't possibly cover everything. So let's move on. Now, I did my best to sound foreboding at the end of the second chapter, but in actuality, Psygnosis' changes weren't terrible or anything. It was to be expected as they'd gradually become hotter and hotter. Psygnosis' forward thinking had brought them to the very forefront of games development and publishing in the early 90s, one of the hottest independent companies out there. And so big folks naturally started to sniff around. And in 1993, the inevitable would happen. Psygnosis were acquired by Sony. Of course, that sounds like a massive deal now, but, well, what did that actually mean to the layman in 1993? Sony were not exactly a big name in the world of video games back then, although we knew they were doing something. In 1993, details were very scarce on just what the PlayStation was going to be. The deal with Nintendo had already or was about to disintegrate. They couldn't possibly be trying to go it alone, could they? Anyway, presuming that this was the case, obviously Sony needed some good, strong companies to provide games for the new machine, and Psygnosis were at or near the top of their wish list. Still, observers might have thought that the whole thing was a bit of a risk, or be flat out worried about it, or worried that Psygnosis would change irrevocably after it. PlayStation Legend points to a specific moment when it was clear that Sony was serious, however. An invite-only conference in London for game studios hosted by Sony at the end of 1993, where they showed off the legendary Demo 1, aka the Walking T-Rex. Psygnosis, being the early adopters, helped SCE to put this conference together, which, seeing as that basically just consisted of Phil Harrison and no one else, was kind of needed. In any case, this was their future. Before that though, a couple of years of transition and other games. There's some really good ones here, some weird ones, and yeah, a couple of terrible ones. There's a whole bunch of things to cover, so it's best taken in segments. First up, let's go through the big developers we've already introduced, starting with DMA, who have two more original games coming up that aren't lemons, both of which were fairly well known and came out in 1993. Walker is perhaps their most intense action title yet. You control a mech that's fighting all sorts of bastards through the ages, starting with the Nazis. You move with the joystick and shoot using the mouse, which actually works out alright. It's like a different take on Cabal. It's quite a nasty, violent game too. Lots of explosions, guts and shouts of "Die, scumbag!" Interestingly, it was the Little Infantrymen in an earlier version of the game that inspired the little walking animation that resulted in Lemmings. And then there's Hired Guns. Holy hell, this game. It's a cyberpunk RPG that can be played by 4 people simultaneously, complete with your mercenaries chatting to each other at every step of the way, usually quoting from Aliens. Think Eye of the Beholder, only with 4 separate screens, more machine guns, and lots of mutated abominations. Now, I am terrible at this sort of game, but they don't half put you on edge. This game pushes a standard A1200 almost to the limit, and it can hardly be summed up in the minute I have to devote to it. It's quite a long and very in-depth game that some would say is amongst the very best Amiga games. I mean, I may have lost 3 of my band of streetwise murder sisters on the first freaking mission, but it is damn enjoyable. Other than that, there was, of course, plenty more Lemmings. By this point we'd already seen the first standalone expansion to the original, Oh No More Lemmings, as well as a special Christmas Lemmings release, the first of 2. In 1993 they would release the excellent Lemmings 2 The Tribes, a game which added a load more different roles, tons of cute references to other Psygnosis games, as in the first one, and a lot more cuteness. It's my favourite game in the series without a doubt, and one that I've covered in a video before, and I would like to once again say that it is massively worth playing. And then, quite shockingly, DMA Design made the switch to Nintendo in 1994 with the release of Uni Racers. What with Lemmings and all that, DMA had obviously made themselves look pretty attractive too. There was just enough time though for DMA to release one more Lemmings game, All New World of Lemmings. This game changed the formula drastically, with a new system that allows the Lemmings roles to change, the ability for Lems to use items, and lots of other little tweaks. In many ways though, it doesn't feel altogether like a Lemmings game, and honestly, I'm not a fan of it. And so DMA flew away from their backers. While the Nintendo relationship eventually fizzled out, they soon found themselves making a rather violent top-down driving sandbox for some chancers called BMG Interactive. BMG Interactive gets bought by Take-Two, Take-Two rename it Rockstar, DMA moved to Gremlin, then to Infogrames, and then finally to Take-Two, who give the studio an appropriate name that fits the new branding. The rest is, as they say, history. Oh, and also watchable in a series that I did elsewhere on my channel. What about Reflections, the makers of The Beast? Well, they have one fairly minor game in this period that does kind of strike a nostalgia chord for me. Wine the Lion, which was one of the games packed in with my A1200 in 1994, alongside an utterly criminal port of Total Carnage. This is better, but not by a lot. An animal platformer at a time when those had become slightly cliché, Wine the Lion seems to be trying to sell itself as a potential SNES conversion, with lots of kind of impressive Mode 7 type stuff. However, by 1994 nobody gave a shit and the game was almost immediately doomed to obscurity. If you tried to come up with the most generic animal mascot platform you could possibly envision, it wouldn't be that far away from Wine the Lion. It's, not very good at all. You would be amazed to find out it comes from the same guys who did Shadow of the Beast. Still, we'll be seeing Reflections again later on. What about Traveller's Tales? There's only one traditional game from them in this period, Hugsy from 1993. It's a puzzle platformer with cutesy graphics, something that's now becoming fairly common. It's not exactly the best example either, and it's hard to pin that down. Mechanically it's fine enough, but it's just so boring and nondescript. Such games were becoming kind of typical, and it doesn't help that we'll be seeing a considerably better example in a little while. So, meh. However, the studio would also be part of an agreement that included, at various times, Psygnosis, Sony, and Disney. This allowed them to produce Bram Stoker's Dracula for the 16-bit consoles, and more importantly, the excellent Mickey Mania. Both of these were published under the Sony ImageSoft label though. Gradually, Traveller's Tales drifted away too, finding themselves a part of the Sega Empire when they made a couple of Sonic games. Martin Chudley's Ways in Hell software, now known as Lunatic, also produced their second game, Wiz and Liz, an ultra-fast against-the-clock platformer where you save some wascally rabbits, all the while spelling out words, getting ingredients, and desperately staying ahead of the time. Yeah, this game is awesome. I love it, and it's even better with a second player. It's definitely one of the best games of Psygnosis' later years on the Amiga. Not long after this, Chudley would finally decide on a new name, that being, of course, Bizarre Creations. So, Psygnosis' big four developer teams were all in various stages of flux. That wasn't all they had though. They soon found themselves pairing up with other great, more established developers, even if it was for a brief time. Two 1994 games in particular are cases in point, the first being Benefactor. This is the only game to be published by Psygnosis and developed by an already great European name that is still very familiar now, Digital Illusion CE, or DICE for short. DICE were then mostly famous for their classic pinball games, of course, and Benefactor was their first game to go outside of that bubble. Benefactor is another puzzle platformer, but one that is better than Pugsy in every possible way it is to be better. There's a real bite and challenge to the puzzles, all of which involve saving another load of little people. The controls are great, it's kind of like a miniaturized cinematic platformer, with a fantastic art style, great music to go along with. This
We'll end
is
it
just
here.
bloody fantastic.